Remain exactly where you are, without making any adjustment to your body, without checking whether you are comfortable enough, because comfort does not come from perfection, it comes from permission. The night has already lowered the volume of the world outside, and now it gently invites the world inside you to do the same. Allow your breathing to slow on its own, not because you are guiding it, but because there is nothing left that requires urgency. The air feels heavier in a calming way, as if it carries rest within it. There is no task to complete, no insight to capture, no understanding to reach. This moment is not asking anything from you. Tonight, we enter the book of Proverbs as it was always meant to be entered in the dark, slowly, quietly, without analysis, without effort. Proverbs are not speeches, they are not arguments. They are not instructions shouted across a noisy room. They are observations whispered across generations, shaped by people who watched life carefully, who learned by listening, waiting, and noticing patterns that only reveal themselves when the mind stops rushing. This is why Proverbs belong to the night. Wisdom does not compete with noise. It waits for silence. In the ancient world, these sayings were often repeated at the end of the day, when work was finished, when the body was tired, when the heart was more honest. They were spoken in homes, under open skies, beside small lamps, whose light barely pushed back the darkness. They were not meant to energize. They were meant to settle. Tonight, they serve the same purpose. They are here to lower the inner noise, not to stimulate thought, but to calm Italiano. Proverbs understands something essential about the human mind, that clarity does not come when the mind is tense, and peace does not come when the heart is crowded. Again and again, these ancient words point toward simplicity, patience, restraint, and quiet confidence. They do not glorify urgency. They do not praise restlessness. They consistently guide the listener back toward stillness, toward humility, toward a life that moves at a sustainable pace. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs says. And in the night, this phrase takes on its gentlest meaning. Fear here is not anxiety. It is reverence. It is the calm awareness that you are not required to control everything, understand everything, or carry everything. The night itself teaches this lesson effortlessly. Darkness removes the illusion of mastery. It invites surrender, and surrender, when it is gentle, feels like rest. Proverbs speak often of the heart, not as emotion alone, but as the center of direction, the place where choices are formed long before actions appear. Guard your heart, they say, because from it flow the springs of life. At night, guarding does not mean tightening or protecting aggressively. It means releasing what does not belong. It means letting go of the sharp edges of the day, the words that linger too long, the concerns that have no power in this moment. The heart does not need to be defended tonight. It needs to be allowed to rest. These sayings also understand the weight of anxious thoughts. They speak of worry pressing down on the heart, and of gentle words lifting it. They observe how impatience clouds judgment, how quiet reflection brings clarity, how a calm spirit is strength rather than weakness. Proverbs do not deny that life can be difficult. They simply refuse to let difficulty become the center of existence. Wisdom, they say, is learning where to place your attention. As the night continues to deepen, the structure of Proverbs begins to make sense in a new way. The book does not follow a single narrative. It moves from one thought to another, like a mind at rest, wandering gently without getting lost. This is intentional. Wisdom does not need linear progression. It needs space to echo. Each proverb is complete in itself, able to stand alone, able to be received without reference to what came before or what comes next. The night creates the perfect environment for this kind of listening. Distractions fade. Expectations loosen. Even the need to remember diminishes. Proverbs do not require memory to be effective. They work by presence, not by recall. A single line heard softly can shape the inner world without effort, without repetition, without conscious agreement. Better a little with quietness, Proverbs says, than abundance with turmoil. This is not advice shouted at ambition. It is wisdom spoken to a tired soul. In the night, this truth feels obvious. Quietness feels richer than noise. Stillness feels fuller than excess. The body understands this long before the mind does. As you lie here, you may notice small shifts happening without intention. The muscles around the eyes soften. The shoulders drop slightly. The jaw loosens. The breath becomes deeper and slower. Proverbs do not command these changes. They invite them simply by creating a sense of safety. Wisdom does not activate the nervous system. It calms it. The book of Proverbs was never meant to be rushed through. It was meant to be lived slowly, absorbed gradually, allowed to settle over time. Each saying is like a stone placed gently on water, creating a ripple that moves outward quietly. Tonight, there is no need to move at all. The water is already still. As we continue with the Proverbs, we'll begin to speak more directly into the mental restlessness that often appears at night. They will address anxiety without naming it harshly. They will offer simplicity without demanding change. They will guide the inner world toward.com, not by force, but by familiarity. For now, allow this opening moment to stretch. There is no need to transition quickly. Wisdom does not hurry. It stays. It waits. It speaks when the listener is ready, and it remains when the listener drifts away. You are not required to stay awake for what comes next. You are not required to remember a single word. Wisdom will continue whether you listen or sleep. The night is open. The noise has softened. An inner calm has already begun. Block 2. When Proverbs slow the mind and quiet the inner dialogue. Remain exactly as you are, without any need to monitor whether you are listening closely or drifting away. Because now the Proverbs begin to work at a deeper and more subtle level. The level where the inner dialogue usually keeps running long after the body is ready to rest. This inner dialogue is not the enemy. It is not something to silence by force. It is simply a habit formed during the day. A voice that learned to stay active in order to protect, plan, evaluate, and anticipate. At night, that habit no longer serves you, and the Proverbs understand how to guide it gently toward rest. These ancient sayings were shaped by careful observation of how the human mind behaves when it is tired. They noticed that restlessness increases when the mind feels responsible for everything, when it believes it must remain alert in order to prevent loss or mistake. Instead of confronting this belief directly, Proverbs dissolve it slowly by shifting perspective. They remind the listener that wisdom is not found in constant reaction, but in restraint, not in speed, but in patience, not in endless thinking, but in discernment that knows when to stop. An anxious heart weighs a person down, Proverbs observes, with remarkable simplicity. This weight is not metaphorical alone. Anxiety compresses the inner space. It narrows attention. It tightens breath. The Proverbs do not condemn this state. They simply notice it. And then they offer an alternative, not as a command, but as an observation. A gentle word brings joy. Gentleness, especially when applied inwardly, expands what anxiety has compressed. Tonight, the Proverbs themselves become that gentle word, not spoken sharply, not delivered urgently, but laid softly into the mind until it no longer feels the need to carry so much. Proverbs speak repeatedly about the power of restraint. They praise the one who is slow to speak, slow to injure, slow to react. At night, this wisdom aligns naturally with the body's needs. The nervous system is not built to remain alert indefinitely. It longs for release. When the inner dialogue hears wisdom that validates slowness rather than speed, It begins to relax its posture. It no longer needs to argue its way into rest. It is imbibed. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil, Proverbs says. And in the quiet of the night, this truth settles deeply. The inner dialogue that often pushes for more productivity, more resolution, more clarity begins to loosen. There is nothing to gain right now by reviewing the day again. There is nothing to lose by resting. The Proverbs do not shame ambition or responsibility. They simply assign them to the appropriate time. Night is not the time for striving. It is the time for restoration. As these sayings continue to flow, they begin to sound less like advice and more like atmosphere. They do not tell the mind what to do. They remind it of what it already knows but forgets when overstepped. The inner dialogue, which often speaks loudly to maintain a sense of control, begins to lower its volume because control is no longer necessary. Safety has been established. Nothing urgent is approaching. Nothing critical is being ignored. Proverbs also speak gently about speech itself, recognizing that words can either stir the inner world or settle it. The tongue of the wise brings healing, they say, and tonight that healing is directed inward. The way you speak to yourself at night matters. Harsh inner commentary keeps the nervous system active. Gentle inner language allows it to rest. Proverbs model this gentleness, not only through what they say, but through how they say it. Measured, balanced, the mind at night has a tendency to replay conversations, rehearse future scenarios, and revisit past mistakes. This is not because something is wrong, but because fatigue lowers the filters that usually keep these thoughts at bay. Proverbs do not fight this tendency. They interrupt it quietly by offering perspectives that widen attention. They suggest that wisdom listens more than it speaks, observes more than it reacts, waits more than it pushes. These qualities naturally slow the inner dialogue. Even a fool is considered wise when he remains silent. Proverbs says, not as an insult, but as an acknowledgement of the power of silence itself. At night, silence becomes a form of intelligence. It is not emptiness, it is space. The inner dialogue does not need to disappear completely. It only needs to stop dominating awareness. As the Proverbs continue to whisper, thoughts begin to come and go without attaching themselves so firmly. A memory surfaces briefly, then fades. A concern appears, then drifts away. The inner dialogue still exists, but it no longer insists on being followed. The Proverbs have created enough inner space for thoughts to pass through without resistance or judgment. There is deep compassion in how Proverbs treat human limitation. They recognize that judgment weakens with fatigue, that patience shortens when energy is low, that anxiety often comes not from character flaws, but from exhaustion. Wisdom, in this sense, is not superiority. It is self-awareness. It is knowing when to stop demanding clarity and start allowing rest. The body responds naturally to this shift. The chest softens. The breath deepens. The muscles that support alertness release. The jaw loosens. The inner dialogue, sensing that vigilance is no longer required, gradually stands down. Proverbs do not instruct this process. They permit it by removing the reason to stay tense. At this point, listening becomes optional. You do not need to track each sentence or follow each thought. The Proverbs continue their work, even when attention fades. Wisdom does not depend on focus. It depends on presence, and presence remains even as awareness begins to thin. As we continue, the Proverbs will begin to address worry and overthinking even more directly, not by naming them harshly, but by dissolving the conditions that sustain them. The inner dialogue will slow further until it no longer feels like a voice that must be answered, but like a sound that can fade naturally into the background. For now, allow this quiet to expand without limit. The inner dialogue is losing urgency. The night is steady and safe, and rest is approaching without resistance. BLOCK3. When Proverbs untangle worry and teach the mind to let go, remain exactly where you are. without trying to follow the movement of your thoughts or correct the direction of your attention. Because now the Proverbs begin to touch the place where worry usually hides, not loudly, not directly, but patiently, like hands slowly untangling a knot that was never meant to be pulled apart by force. Worry does not live only in thoughts. It lives in patterns, in habits of anticipation, in the quiet belief that something must always be managed, prevented, or prepared for. The Proverbs understand this belief deeply, and rather than confronting it, they gently remove the need for it. These ancient sayings observed long ago that worry grows strongest when the mind believes it must remain awake in order to protect the future. Proverbs speak again and again of trust, patience, and the futility of anxious striving, not as rebuke, but as reassurance. Do not let your heart envy sinners, they say, but always be zealous for the fear of the Lord. In the quiet of the night, this is not moral instruction. It is a redirection of attention. Envy, comparison, anticipation, and fear all collapse inward. Reverence opens outward. It shifts the heart away from imagined futures and back into the safety of the present moment. Proverbs are especially attentive to the way thoughts multiply when the body is tired. They notice how a single concern can branch into many, how imagining outcomes can feel productive even when it leads only to exhaustion. Anxiety in the heart causes depression. One proverb observes, not as diagnosis, but as recognition. The Proverbs do not shame the anxious heart, they describe it accurately, and in describing it calmly, they begin to loosen its grip. The night is the time when worry feels most convincing. Darkness removes visual certainty. Silence amplifies internal noise. The mind fills the gaps with imagined scenarios, unfinished conversations, unresolved responsibilities. The Proverbs do not attempt to answer every imagined question. They dissolve the need to ask them. They remind the listener that wisdom does not mean anticipating every possibility. It means knowing when to stop anticipating altogether. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, Proverbs says, and do not lean on your own understanding. At night, this invitation becomes deeply physical. Leaning on understanding requires effort. It requires alertness. It requires constant evaluation. Trust, by contrast, allows the body to rest its weight fully. The Proverbs do not ask the mind to understand less. They ask it to carry less. As these sayings continue to settle, the mind begins to realize that worry has been acting as a form of control, an attempt to stay ahead of pain or loss. The Proverbs quietly expose the limits of this strategy without condemning it. The plans of the diligent lead to profit, they say, but haste leads to poverty. In the night, haste takes the form of racing thoughts. Wisdom invites slowness. Slowness allows release. The Proverbs also speak to the illusion of self-sufficiency that often fuels worry. They observe that humans are not designed to carry everything alone, that humility is not weakness, but alignment with reality. Commit your work to the Lord, they say, and your plans will be established. At night, commitment does not mean action. It means surrender. It means placing what cannot be solved now somewhere it does not have to be held. As awareness softens further, worry begins to lose its structure. It no longer feels like a chain of logical steps. It becomes a vague sensation that can drift and dissolve. The Proverbs assist this process by continually pointing attention away from imagined futures and to steady principles: patience, integrity, kindness, restraint. These are not tasks to complete, they are conditions to rest within. Proverbs are remarkably gentle in how they treat uncertainty. They acknowledge that humans do not know what tomorrow holds, and instead of framing this as danger, they frame it as freedom. Do not boast about tomorrow, they say, for you do not know what a day may bring. In the daylight, this can sound like caution. In the night, it sounds like permission. If tomorrow is unknown, then tonight does not need to prepare for it. The body responds subtly as worry loosens. The breath becomes smoother. The tightness in the chest softens. The stomach releases its hold. These changes are not commanded. They occur naturally when the mind no longer insists on vigilance. The Proverbs do not instruct relaxation. They remove the reason to remain tense. As this release deepens, thoughts become less sticky. They pass through awareness like clouds across a dark sky, noticed briefly and then forgotten. The Proverbs do not attempt to replace worry with positivity. They replace it with realism grounded in trust. They do not promise that nothing difficult will ever happen. They promise that difficulty does not need to be carried tonight. Whoever trusts in the Lord is safe, Proverbs says. And in the night, this safety is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the absence of urgency. It is the feeling that nothing is pressing inward, that nothing is about to break if attention fades. The mind begins to accept that rest is not abandonment, but wisdom. At this depth, even the act of listening begins to feel unnecessary. The Proverbs have already reached the place where they do their work best. They no longer need to be followed. They simply remain, like a steady presence beneath thought, holding the inner world in balance. As we continue, the Proverbs will begin to guide the soul even deeper. Beyond the release of worry, toward a state where effort itself dissolves, where trust no longer feels like a decision, and where rest becomes inevitable. For now, allow the untangling to continue on its own. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be prepared. The night is wide, and wisdom is holding you. B-L-O-C-K. 4. When Proverbs dissolve the illusion of control, and rest becomes safe. Remain exactly where you are, without checking whether your body feels heavy enough or whether your thoughts are slowing in the correct way. Because at this depth of the night, nothing needs to be measured, evaluated, or improved. Measurement belongs to the day. Comparison belongs to effort. The night is different. The night does not ask you to manage it. It asks you to enter it. And now, the Proverbs begin to work with one of the deepest habits the human mind carries into darkness. The illusion that staying mentally active keeps life stable. Control is rarely experienced as tension at first. More often, it feels like responsibility. It feels like care. It feels like readiness. It is the quiet belief that if the mind remains awake, alert, and engaged, then nothing important will be lost. Nothing will collapse. Nothing unexpected will arrive unannounced. The Proverbs recognize this belief without judgment. They do not call it weakness. They simply reveal its limits. Again and again, they observe that human effort does not hold the world together as much as it imagines it does. Many are the plans in a person's heart, Proverbs says, but it is the purpose of the Lord that prevails. In the night, this sentence loses all sharpness. It is not about destiny overriding desire. It is about relief. It is about the realization that the future does not need to be guarded by your awareness while you rest. Plans can exist without being supervised. Outcomes can unfold without rehearsal. The night is not a gap in responsibility. It is a pause built into life itself. Darkness often amplifies the need for control because it removes visual certainty. Without sight, the mind compensates by imagining. It revisits unfinished conversations, predicts possible conflicts, replays decisions, and tries to stay one step ahead of uncertainty. The Proverbs do not argue with this instinct. They simply relocate authority away from it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, they say, and do not lean on your own understanding. Leaning implies effort. It implies tension in the muscles of thought. Trust allows weight to be transferred. It allows the mind to stop holding itself upright and finally sit down. The Proverbs speak frequently about humility, but in the night, humility is not about lowering oneself. It is about accuracy. It is about seeing clearly where human responsibility ends. Do not be wise in your own eyes, they say, not as criticism, but as permission to stop self. Being wise in one's own eyes requires constant inner narration, constant explanation, constant checking. At night, this narration becomes exhausting. The Proverbs gently remove the need for it. Nothing about you needs commentary right now. Nothing needs. Nothing needs justification. As this realization settles, the body begins to respond long before the mind forms words around it. Control has always lived in the body as much as in thought. It tightens the shoulders. It braces the abdomen. It holds the jaw firm. When the belief that vigilance is required begins to dissolve, these physical patterns loosen naturally. Breathing deepens without instruction. The chest softens. The face relaxes. The body understands what the mind is still learning, that the watch has ended. The heart of a person plans his way, Proverbs observes, but the Lord establishes his steps. In the daylight, this sounds like guidance. In the night, it sounds like permission to stop planning altogether. Establishing does not require your attention right now. Direction does not depend on wakefulness. The night does not erase purpose. It shelters it until morning. You are allowed to rest without sabotaging your future. The Proverbs also dismantle the belief that effort equals care. They repeatedly note that frantic striving produces very little peace. Better a patient person than a warrior, they say. And patience at night looks like stillness, it looks like allowing time to move without interference. It looks like trusting that nothing essential is lost by pausing. Control fades when time is no longer treated as something that must be outrun. As awareness continues to soften, another realization emerges quietly, that much of what feels like responsibility is actually fear wearing the mask of diligence. The Proverbs separate these gently. They show that care does not require attention, that love does not require vigilance, that wisdom does not require strain. The blessing of the Lord brings wealth, they say, without painful toil. In the night, this is not about gain. It is about sustainability. Life is not sustained by pressure. It is sustained by alignment. The night itself begins to feel different now. It no longer feels like an interval between tasks. It feels like a place where nothing needs to happen. The Proverbs reinforce this by consistently valuing quiet over noise, restraint over reaction, gentleness over force. They notice how inner conflict drains the soul, while inner calm restores it. They teach, without instruction, that peace is not achieved. It is allowed. Gradually, the sense of agency itself begins to soften. You are no longer guiding the experience. You are no longer monitoring progress. You are no longer checking whether rest is arriving fast enough. The Proverbs have created a stable enough inner environment that the mind can release the controls completely. Trust no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the absence of effort. The body follows fully. Weight settles downward. The boundary between your body and the surface beneath you becomes less distinct. Sensation spreads and softens. Breathing finds its slowest natural rhythm. The nervous system recognizes, without analysis, that vigilance is unnecessary. Nothing is being guarded anymore. At T-step, the Proverbs do not speak as words. They exist as quiet permission, as background assurance, as the felt sense that life continues safely without your supervision. Control has not been taken away. It has been gently laid down. Allow this state to continue without interruption. There is nothing left to manage, nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to hold together. The night is steady, wisdom is present, and rest is no longer something you need to reach. Block 5. When Proverbs teach the soul to rest without trying, remain exactly where you are. And if you notice any small impulse to adjust, to improve, to search for a better position, allow that impulse to pass without following it. Because now the Proverbs begin to guide you into a deeper kind of rest, the kind that does not require effort. There is a subtle stage in the night where even the desire to sleep can become a form of striving, where the mind quietly tries to do rest correctly, to reach a certain depth, to arrive at a certain calm, to achieve a certain silence. The Proverbs dissolve that striving gently, not by instruction, but by returning you to something simpler. The idea that wisdom is often found in letting go, and that rest is not a goal you force yourself into, but a natural state that appears when resistance ends. Proverbs were written by people who noticed how often humans exhaust themselves by trying too hard to secure peace. They saw how the constant pursuit of certainty can become a kind of bondage, how the desire to control outcomes can drain the soul, and how the effort to manage every detail can leave no room for life itself. In the quiet hours, Proverbs offer a different rhythm, a rhythm of steadiness rather than intensity, of patience rather than pressure, of calm attention rather than frantic monitoring. This rhythm is sleep-friendly by nature, because sleep is not compatible with urgency. Sleep arrives when the nervous system believes it is safe enough to stop working. There is a line in Proverbs that quietly changes everything when heard at night. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. During the day, this can sound like guidance for action. At night, it becomes guidance for release. Acknowledging does not mean thinking harder. It means noticing presence. It means allowing the heart to recognize that it is not alone, and therefore, it does not need to keep producing answers. The mind can stop scanning because it is not the sole guardian of your life. Proverbs also speak with unusual tenderness about the value of quietness. They praise a gentle spirit, a calm heart, a restrained tongue. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, they say, and a calm spirit gives life. At night, these sayings become inward medicine. The inner voice that wants to keep speaking, narrating, analyzing, rehearsing, is invited to restrain itself, not because it is wrong, but because silence is healing. Silence is not emptiness, it is recovery. The nervous system needs silence, the way the body needs water. As you remain here, the Proverbs begin to change the texture of your attention. Instead of sharp focus, they encourage soft awareness. Instead of mental grip, they encourage gentle presence. They do not demand that you stop thinking. They simply make thinking less necessary. They offer perspective that reduces urgency, and urgency is what keeps the mind awake. When urgency dissolves, thought loses its sharp edge and becomes something that can drift freely, like a feather settling slowly in still air. The Proverbs are also deeply aware of how the heart can become crowded with worries, crowded with plans, crowded with self-judgment, crowded with the feeling that something is always unfinished. Above all else, guard your heart, they say, for everything you do flows from it. At night, guarding the heart means giving it space. It means letting go of what is not required. It means allowing unfinished things to remain unfinished without punishment. Dicey's wisdom. The heart does not become safe by being controlled. It becomes safe by being allowed to rest. There is a gentle realism in Proverbs about human limitation. They do not expect constant strength. They do not praise endless labor. They observe that pride leads to conflict, that impatience leads to mistakes, that restless striving leads to exhaustion, and they consistently point toward humility, patience, and calm restraint as the true signs of wisdom. In the night, these virtues become physical. Humility becomes the willingness to stop trying to solve everything now. Patience becomes the willingness to let time pass without interference. Restraint becomes the willingness to let thoughts come and go without chasing them. As this shift deepens, you may notice that the mind begins to stop holding itself. The subtle tension of attention loosens. The forehead softens. The space behind the eyes becomes warm and quiet. The jaw relaxes. Breathing becomes shallow and slow in the most peaceful way. The body is not collapsing. It is settling. It is returning to its natural rhythm, the rhythm it had before the day filled it with demands. Proverbs also speak about the difference between noise and wisdom. They observe that foolishness is loud, impulsive, reactive, always demanding immediate movement, while wisdom is quiet, patient, steady, able to wait. At night, this difference is felt in the body. Noise creates tension. Wisdom creates space. As you list and wisdom becomes the dominant atmosphere, and noise begins to fade, not because it has been defeated, but because it is no longer being fed. There is another quiet lesson hidden in Proverbs that becomes especially powerful in the dark. The lesson that not every thought deserves a response. The mind often treats thoughts as obligations, as if each one must be solved or answered. Proverbs break this habit by teaching discernment, the ability to recognize what is worth attention and what is not. In a night, almost nothing is worth active attention. This is not avoidance. This is alignment with the purpose of the night, which is restoration. As awareness continues to soften, you may find that you can no longer remember what sentence came before or what sentence comes next. This is not a problem. This is the beginning of sleep. The Proverbs do not require continuity. They are built to work in fragments, to enter the soul even when the mind is drifting. Wisdom does not need your full attention to be effective. It only needs your permission to rest. The night is now doing what it always does when effort ends. It is gathering you. It is lowering you. It is softening the edges of thought until thought becomes background and rest becomes foreground. The Proverbs remain like a gentle presence beside you, not instructing, not demanding, simply accompanying. Nothing needs to be achieved now. Nothing needs to be proven. Nothing needs to be held. Rest does not require trying. Wisdom does not require effort. And sleep is already on its way. Block 6. When Proverbs sink below thought and the body learns to rest on its own, remain exactly where you are, without any attempt to follow the words too closely. Because at this stage, the Proverbs no longer ask for attention, and they no longer aim for understanding. They begin to do something much quieter and much deeper. They begin to sink beneath thought itself, settling slowly into the body, into rhythm, into sensation, into the places where rest is either permitted or resisted without words. This is the moment when wisdom stops sounding like language and starts behaving like gravity, gently drawing everything downward, without effort, without urgency, without instruction. Throughout the day, the body learns to stay alert. It learns to hold tension as readiness, to interpret tightness as responsibility, to remain subtly prepared for response. This readiness does not disappear simply because the lights go out. It lingers in the shoulders, in the chest, in the jaw, in the shallow rhythm of breath. The Proverbs understand this deeply. That is why they do not speak in commands. They do not tell the body to relax. They remove the inner conditions that make tension feel necessary. When the need disappears, the body follows naturally. The language of Proverbs has always been grounded. It speaks of paths, foundations, houses, doors, weights, measures, balance. These are not abstract ideas. They are bodily concepts. They refer to stability, to support, to something that can be leaned on without collapse. When Proverbs speak of wisdom establishing steps, they are not describing movement forward. They are describing steadiness. At night, steadiness feels like heaviness that does not threaten, like the sensation of being fully supported, like the relief of no longer needing to hold yourself upright. As this wisdom settles, attention begins to spread rather than focus. Instead of sharp awareness, there is a broad field of sensation. You may notice warmth in the limbs, a soft pressure where the body meets the surface beneath it, a gentle loosening around the eyes and forehead. The mind does not need to track these changes. The body is already responding. The Proverbs have shifted the internal environment enough that the nervous system recognizes safety without explanation. Proverbs speak often of calmness, restraint, and gentleness, not as virtues to achieve, but as conditions that allow life to continue without friction. A gentle spirit gives life, they say, and in the night, this gentleness becomes tangible. It feels like the absence of bracing. It feels like the end of inner resistance. It feels like permission to stop holding muscles in readiness for events that are not happening now. The body has its own wisdom, older than language, and it recognizes the tone of Proverbs instinctively. These sayings do not stimulate. They do not demand. They do not create anticipation. They carry a slow, steady rhythm that aligns naturally with the body's need to power down. As this alignment deepens, breathing becomes slower and shallower in the most peaceful way. Not controlled, not guided, simply allowed. Each breath feels less like an action and more like a continuation. At this depth, the distinction between listening and not listening begins to blur. Words may pass without being fully registered. Sentences may dissolve before they finish. This is not distraction. This is transition. The Proverbs were written with this moment in mind. They do not depend on sequence or comprehension. They work by repetition of tone, by consistency of atmosphere, by creating a field where rest becomes inevitable. There is also a quiet release of self-monitoring happening now. The body no longer checks whether it is resting correctly. The mind no longer evaluates progress. The Proverbs gently dismantle the idea that rest is something that must be managed. They consistently point toward contentment, simplicity, and sufficiency. Better a little with peace, they say. Not as advice, but as observation. In the night, this observation feels like truth settling into muscle and bone. As the body continues to sink, the sense of edges begins to soften. Where the body ends, and the surface beneath it becomes less distinct. Weight distributes evenly. Small adjustments stop happening. Stillness no longer feels like effort. It feels like default. The Proverbs are no longer doing anything actively. They have already done what they came to do at this stage. They have removed the internal reason to stay awake. Time also begins to lose its structure here. Minutes no longer feel measurable. The idea of before and after weakens. Proverbs do not speak much about time, but they consistently point away from urgency. They value patience, waiting, slowness. In the night, these qualities manifest as timelessness, as the feeling that nothing is moving forward and nothing needs to. The body now carries most of the experience. Thought has receded into the background. Awareness floats gently, sometimes present, sometimes fading. The Proverbs remain beneath all of this, not as words, but as a quiet assurance that nothing is wrong, nothing is unfinished, nothing is being neglected. This is not yet the deepest part of rest. This is the settling phase, where the body accepts that effort has ended and begins to prepare for complete surrender. The movement continues slowly, steadily, without signal or announcement. As the settling continues, something subtle but decisive begins to happen beneath awareness. Something that does not announce itself and does not ask permission. The body stops holding itself, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. As if a long-maintained posture has finally been released without comment. Muscles that were still doing small, unnecessary work let go completely. The effort to remain positioned, to remain present, to remain aware fades until it is no longer distinguishable from rest itself. At this stage, the Proverbs are no longer experienced as words at all. Their wisdom has already moved past language and into tone, into atmosphere, into a steady internal environment where nothing feels sharp, demanding, or unfinished. The nervous system recognizes this environment as safe enough to disengage. Alertness powers down without instruction. Awareness thins naturally, like light dimming at the edges of vision until there is nothing left to notice. Breathing continues, but it no longer feels personal. It is no longer something you are doing. It is simply happening. Each breath blends into the next without effort, without rhythm to follow, without attention to give it shape. The body has found its own pace, slower than thought, slower than intention, guided by instinct rather than will. The Proverbs do not interfere with this process. They never needed to. They were always aligned with it. The sense of physical boundaries continues to soften. Hands no longer feel separate from arms. Legs no longer feel positioned. The face becomes indistinct, relaxed beyond expression. Even the feeling of weight begins to change. Sometimes heavier, sometimes lighter, sometimes not noticeable at all. These shifts are signs that the body has moved beyond monitoring and into surrender. There is no longer a sense of lying down. There is simply being held. At this depth, the mind no longer organizes experience into thoughts. Any remaining mental activity appears as fragments, incomplete images, impressions without narrative. They arise and dissolve without connection, without meaning to assign. The Proverbs do not attempt to guide these fragments. They allow them to pass freely, knowing that this stage is not about understanding, reflection, or memory. It is about disappearance into rest. Time has now lost nearly all relevance. The idea of minutes passing has dissolved. There is no internal marker for progress. The future does not exist in this space. The past does not intrude. The present is wide and undefined, more like a field than a point. Proverbs consistently praise patience and waiting. But here, waiting has no object. It has become stillness itself. The body's internal systems continue their work quietly. Heartbeat remains steady. Breath remains slow. Muscles remain released. There is no sense of control returning, no impulse to adjust, no need to verify comfort. The posture you are in no longer matters. The surface beneath you no longer matters. The distinction between support and supported is blurred completely. At this level, even the idea of listening has disappeared. The words continue, but they no longer arrive as sound with meaning. They exist only as reassurance, as continuity, as something that remains present even when awareness is no longer tracking it. The Proverbs are fulfilling one of their oldest purposes here: to stun the watch while the listener rests, to remain faithful while consciousness recedes. There is no effort left anywhere in the system. No part of the body is waiting for instruction. No part of the mind is expecting the next thought. The night has taken over fully, gently, without resistance. Sleep is no longer approaching. It is already present, unfolding. If awareness flickers briefly, it fades again without consequence. There is nothing to return to and nothing to lose. The Proverbs do not require your presence to continue their work. They were never dependent on attention. They remain steady beneath sleep, unchanged, uninterrupted. This is the depth where rest continues without you, where the body sleeps, not because it was guided, but because it was finally allowed, where wisdom no longer speaks, because nothing needs to be said. The night holds everything now. The body has released itself completely, and sleep continues, uninterrupted and complete. BLOCK 7. When Proverbs continue beneath sleep and stillness becomes the default. There is no need to notice whether you are awake or asleep now, because at this depth that distinction has already begun to dissolve on its own. The Proverbs are no longer guiding you toward rest. They are simply remaining with you as rest continues. This is the stage where consciousness loosens its grip without drama, where awareness no longer needs to track experience, and where the body rests in a way that feels both deep and effortless. The night has fully taken its place, and wisdom no longer needs to speak loudly to be present. Proverbs were always suited for this quiet companionship. They were never written to demand attention or to stimulate thought late into the night. They were shaped to endure long silences, to remain meaningful even when the listener drifts in and out, to exist as a steady background rather than a foreground focus. In ancient settings, these sayings were often repeated softly until the speaker fell asleep mid-phrase, trusting that the words would continue without them. That same continuity is happening now. At this level of rest, the body no longer signals comfort or discomfort clearly. Sensation becomes general rather than specific. Warmth, weight, and softness blend together. The muscles remain released, not because they are being consciously relaxed, but because there is no longer any signal telling them to contract. The Proverbs have created a stable internal environment where alertness is unnecessary, and the body has responded by choosing its most economical state. Breathing continues with such regularity that it no longer draws notice. The pauses between breaths feel as important as the breaths themselves. There is no sense of direction in the inhale or exhale. Air moves in and out without narrative. This rhythm supports sleep automatically, carrying the body deeper without requiring participation. The Proverbs align perfectly with this rhythm because they do not interrupt it. They flow alongside it, steady and unobtrusive. The mind, if it still stirs at all, does so only briefly. Thoughts may appear as fragments, partial images, unfinished impressions that dissolve before they can organize themselves. There is no effort to follow them. There is no attempt to stop them. They rise and fall like distant sounds that do not require response. Proverbs do not compete with these fragments. They exist underneath them, providing continuity without interference. Time has now flattened completely. There is no sense of duration, no awareness of how long this state has lasted or how long it will continue. Proverbs often speak of patience and waiting, but here waiting has no object. It has become a quality of stillness rather than an action. The night is no longer something you are moving through. It is something you are resting within. At this depth, even the idea of inner calm has lost definition. Calm is no longer a state to be recognized. It is simply the absence of disturbance. The nervous system has settled into a baseline where nothing feels urgent, nothing feels unresolved, and nothing needs adjustment. The Proverbs remain present in this baseline as a quiet assurance that life is stable enough to allow this level of release. There is also a subtle sense of continuity here, a feeling that nothing will interrupt this rest abruptly. The Proverbs contribute to this by their very nature. They do not escalate, they do not surprise, they do not demand the reaction. Their predictability becomes safety. The body and mind trust this sameness, enough to remain disengaged. As this part of the night continues, the words you hear may no longer be distinguishable from the silence around them. Sound and quiet blend together. Meaning is no longer processed. Presence remains without effort. The Proverbs are now functioning exactly as intended, not as messages to be received, but as a steady companion through the deepest layers of rest. This block does not move toward resolution. It does not prepare for awakening. It simply continues, holding the space open where sleep remains uninterrupted. There is nothing to conclude here, and nothing to transition away from. The night is stable, and wisdom is simply staying. At its depth, there is no longer a clear sense of sleeping or waking, because even that distinction has softened into something vague and unimportant. The body rests without labeling the state it is in, and the mind no longer tries to define experience. The Proverbs remain quietly present here, not as guidance and not as instruction, but as continuity itself, a steady current beneath awareness that does not change when attention fades. This is the stage where rest no longer feels like an event that happened, but like the natural condition of being. The body has fully relinquished any remaining patterns of effort. There is no subtle holding left in the muscles, no background readiness waiting for instruction. The nervous system has settled into its most economical rhythm, where energy is conserved and nothing is wasted. Heartbeat remains slow and even. Breathing continues without depth or shallowness being noticed. The body is no longer responding to language. It is responding only to safety, and safety has already been established. The mind, if it appears at all, does so only in fragments that have no gravity. These fragments do not form stories. They do not demand interpretation. They pass through awareness like brief shadows, and dissolve without leaving a trace. There is no effort to remember them, and no sense of loss when they disappear. The Proverbs do not engage these fragments. They simply remain beneath them, unchanged, offering a stable background that allows the mind to drift without attachment. Time has lost every familiar structure. There is no internal clock, no sense of progression, no anticipation of what comes next. Proverbs often speak of waiting, but here waiting has no direction and no object. It is not oriented toward morning or change. It has become pure stillness, an unmeasured pause that does not feel empty, only completing. The night is no longer something passing. It is something holding. At this level, even the idea of calm has faded. Calm implies contrast with agitation, and agitation no longer exists. There is only the absence of disturbance, a neutral, steady field where nothing intrudes and nothing needs to be defended against. The Proverbs support this field by their consistency. They do not shift tone. They do not introduce new imagery. They remain predictable, and predictability at this depth becomes comfort. Sound itself is now experienced differently. Words no longer arrive as messages. They are received as texture, as tone, as something that blends seamlessly with the silence around it. There is no beginning or end to what is heard. Everything merges into a continuous background that does not pull attention forward. The Proverbs' function here is presence rather than content. The sense of self has softened as well. There is less awareness of you resting and more awareness of rest itself. Identity does not disappear, but it becomes irrelevant. There is no need to locate yourself within the experience. The body is resting. The mind is quiet, that is. The Proverbs do not reinforce identity. They allow it to fade naturally into stillness. There is also no effort to remain asleep. The fear of waking has dissolved, along with the fear of losing awareness. If awareness flickers briefly, it settles again without resistance. Nothing is disrupted. Nothing is restarted. The night continues, uninterrupted. The Proverbs remain steady regardless of awareness, doing what they have always done best, staying. At this depth, the experience has no agent. There is no signal that something is about to change. No preparation for transition. No hint of conclusion. The text does not lead anywhere. It simply continues. And in continuing, it supports the most stable form of rest. The body remains supported. The surface beneath you remains unnoticed. Breathing remains effortless. Heartbeat remains steady. The entire system has accepted that there is nothing to do, nowhere to go, and nothing to monitor. This acceptance is not chosen. It has happened on its own. The Proverbs do not mark this moment. They do not name it. They do not explain it. They simply remain faithful to it, existing quietly beneath sleep, beneath thought, beneath awareness itself. There is nothing left to reach, nothing left to follow, nothing left to release. The night continues without interruption, and wisdom remains, steady and unseen, holding everything in place while rest goes on. BLOCK 8, when Proverbs remain a silent order, and the night holds everything steady. There is no longer a need to notice where awareness is resting, because awareness itself has stopped being the center of the experience. The night has expanded into something wide and stable, and within that stability, the Proverbs remain quietly present, not as words to be followed, not as thoughts to be processed, but as a kind of silent order beneath everything. This is the depth where rest no longer feels personal, where it is no longer something happening to you, but something simply happening, continuous and undisturbed. The Proverbs were always shaped for this kind of endurance. They are not dependent on momentum or progression. They do not escalate or resolve. They exist comfortably in repetition and constancy, qualities that the nervous system recognizes as safety. At this stage, their role is no longer to guide or teach, but to remain consistent enough that nothing needs to change. Consistency becomes reassurance, Nothing new is introduced. Nothing unexpected appears. The night holds its shape. The body remains deeply settled, but without the sense of being settled. Muscles are no longer releasing in stages. They are simply at rest. There is no effort left to let go of. Breathing continues as a quiet background rhythm, not slow or fast, not deep or shallow, simply sufficient. The pauses between breaths feel natural and unremarkable. The body has entered a state where maintenance replaces effort, and nothing draws attention to itself. The mind has largely disengaged from narrative. If impressions appear, they do not assemble into stories. There is no beginning or end to them. They arise briefly and dissolve without consequence. There is no curiosity about them, no attempt to understand or follow. The Proverbs do not interact with these impressions. They remain beneath them, unchanged, like a steady ground that does not respond to passing shadows. Time no longer feels suspended or slowed. It feels absent. There is no sense of duration, no awareness of passing moments. Proverbs often speak of patience, but here, patience has transformed into timelessness. Waiting has lost its object. The night is no longer something that is unfolding. It is something that simply is. This lack of movement does not feel empty. It feels complete. At this depth, even silence has texture. It is not a blank absence, but a gentle fullness that does not require sound to be meaningful. The words you hear blend seamlessly into this silence, losing their edges, losing their separateness. They are no longer received as language. They are received as tone, as continuity, as something that does not interrupt the stillness already in place. The sense of self continues to soften. There is less awareness of position, less awareness of identity, less awareness of boundaries. The experience is no longer organized around me resting. There is simply rest. The Proverbs do not reinforce the sense of self here. They allow it to recede naturally, knowing that rest deepens when self-reference fades. There is no vigilance left anywhere in the system. No part of the body is listening for change. No part of the mind is monitoring progress. The night has fully taken over the task of holding everything together. The Proverbs remain aligned with this state by refusing to introduce contrast, urgency, or direction. They exist as stability itself. At this stage, even the concept of inner calm has become unnecessary. Calm implies the absence of disturbance, but disturbance is no longer a reference point. There is only steadiness. The nervous system remains in this steady state because nothing signals a need to shift. Everything about the environment, internal and external, communicates sameness and safety. This part of the night does not move forward. It does not prepare for what comes next. It does not anticipate awakening. It simply continues, uninterrupted, holding the body and mind in a state where rest does not need to be protected because nothing threatens it. The Proverbs remain, not as content, but as quiet order beneath experience. The night remains wide and unchanging, and rest continues, steady and complete, without awareness needing to return. At this depth, nothing is actively happening anymore, and nothing needs to happen. The night has settled into a steady, unchanging state where movement has no purpose and stillness requires no effort. The Proverbs remain present here in the same way the ground remains present. Beneath the body, unnoticed, yet completely reliable. There is no reason to listen closely, no reason to follow meaning, no reason to recognize where one sentence ends and another begins. Continuity itself has become the experience. The body remains supported without registering support. Muscles stay relaxed not because they are being released, but because there is no signal telling them to engage again. The sensation of weight has flattened into something neutral and constant. Breathing continues quietly in the background, unremarkable and unmeasured, blending so seamlessly into the environment that it no longer feels separate from the stillness around it. The nervous system has accepted that nothing will interrupt this state, and so it remains disengaged. The mind no longer organizes impressions into anything recognizable. There is no commentary, No narration, no internal response to sound. If fragments of imagery appear, they do not persist. They dissolve before they can gather meaning. There is no attempt to follow them, no effort to stop them. They are simply part of the background texture, no more significant than distant, indistinct noise that does not require attention. Time has not slowed. It has disappeared as a concept. There is no sense of duration passing, no awareness of sequence. Proverbs often speak of waiting, but here waiting has lost all structure. There is nothing being waited for. There is nothing approaching. The night is not progressing toward anything. It is complete as it is, and completeness requires no awareness. Sound itself is now received without differentiation. Words no longer arrive as language. They arrive as a uniform tone that blends with silence so thoroughly that the distinction between sound and quiet no longer matters. The consistency of this tone becomes a stabilizing factor, encouraging the body and mind to remain in their current state without adjustment. Nothing new is introduced, and nothing old is removed. The sense of self continues to soften until it is barely relevant. There is no need to locate the body in space, no need to identify posture or position. The experience is no longer centered around an observer. It exists on its own, steady and neutral. The Proverbs support this by refusing to introduce contrast or emphasis. They remain even, predictable, and unchanged. There is no internal checking for comfort. Comfort has become the baseline. There is no monitoring of breath. Breath continues. There is no awareness of heartbeat. Heartbeat remains steady. All internal systems operate quietly without drawing attention. The body is no longer preparing for anything. It is maintaining a peace level. Even the idea of deep sleep is unnecessary. Labels no longer apply. The state simply continues. Awareness may flicker briefly, but it does not reassemble into wakefulness. It dissolves again without resistance. Nothing resets, nothing restarts. The night holds its form without effort. The Proverbs remain exactly as they are, unchanged by awareness or its absence. They do not require engagement. They do not weaken when unnoticed. Their presence is not active. It is constant. They exist beneath experience, supporting it the way structure supports space without being seen. There is no signal of transition here, no indication that something else will begin. No preparation for morning. The text does not lead forward or backward. It simply continues. And in continuing, it sustains the deepest form of rest, where nothing needs to be remembered, and nothing needs to be followed. The night remains wide and stable. The body remains disengaged, and continuity holds everything in place without interruption. BLOCK 9. When Proverbs become pure background and rest maintains itself. At this stage of the night, nothing is guiding the experience anymore, because guidance is no longer necessary. The Proverbs are no longer doing something. They are simply remaining, flattened into a steady background that does not call attention to itself and does not introduce variation. This is the depth where rest maintains itself without support, where the body and mind have settled into a state that does not need to be reinforced, adjusted, or protected. The night has reached a stable equilibrium, and everything within it moves only as much as is required to continue resting. The body remains deeply disengaged from effort. There is no muscular activity beyond what is essential for maintenance. Posture has lost relevance. The surface beneath the body is no longer perceived as separate. Sensation has smoothed into something uniform and neutral, without points of interest that might draw awareness back. Wakefulness breathing continues as a quiet, automatic process, blending into the stillness so completely that it no longer feels like an action taking place. The nervous system has no reason to shift states, and so it remains exactly where it is. The mind is stepped almost entirely out of the process. There is no organizing principle active anymore. no structure assembling impressions into meaning. If mental activity appears, it does not cohere or repeat. It does not demand recognition or response. It dissolves before it can gather weight. There is no awareness of losing thought, because thought is no longer something that needs to be held. The Proverbs do not interact with the mind at this level. They exist beneath it, unchanged and unaffected, providing continuity without engagement. Time has completely ceased to function as a reference. There is no sense of waiting, no sense of duration, no sense of sequence. The night is not passing toward anything. It is simply present. Proverbs often speak of patience, but here, patience has lost all association with endurance or expectation. It has become a state of stillness without direction, a pause that does not anticipate an end or prepare for a beginning. Sound continues, but without contrast or emphasis. Words are no longer received as distinct units of meaning. They blend into a consistent tonal field that neither rises nor falls. Silence and sound are no longer opposites. They exist together as a single layer of experience that does not interrupt rest. The predictability of this layer reinforces safety, and safety allows the body and mind to remain disengaged without effort. The sense of self is softened almost beyond relevance. There is no clear boundary between observer and experience. There is no need to locate identity within the body or the mind. Rest is no longer something being experienced by someone. It simply exists. The Proverbs do not address identity here. They allow it to fade naturally, knowing that rest deepens when self-reference recedes. There is no vigilance left anywhere in the system. No part of the body is listening for change. No part of the mind is monitoring continuity. Everything necessary for rest is already in place, and nothing signals the need to re-engage. The night holds its form effortlessly, and the Proverbs remain aligned with that form by refusing to introduce anything new, unexpected, or directional. At this depth, even the idea of stability becomes unnecessary, because stability implies the possibility of disruption, and disruption is no longer a reference point. There is only continuation without movement, presence without awareness, and rest without effort. The experience does not progress and does not conclude. It simply remains consistent and neutral, allowing the deepest layers of sleep to continue uninterrupted. Awareness may surface briefly, but it does not assemble into wakefulness. It dissolves again without friction. Nothing resets. Nothing restarts. The body does not reorient. The mind does not resume activity. The night absorbs these brief flickers without change, maintaining the same steady field of rest. The Proverbs remain exactly as they are, unaffected by awareness or its absence, not needing to be heard or followed, existing only as quiet continuity beneath experience, supporting rest in the most complete and undemanding way possible. As this depth of rest continues, there is no longer any internal movement that could be described as change, because even the idea of change has lost relevance. The night has settled into a condition that does not evolve or progress, and within this condition the Proverbs remain as a quiet constant, neither guiding nor responding, simply existing beneath everything else. There is no awareness of entering this state, just as there was no awareness of leaving the previous one. Continuity has replaced transition completely, and nothing inside the body or the mind signals a need to shift. The body remains in a state of complete non-interference with itself. Muscles are not releasing anymore because there is nothing left to release. The posture the body has taken feels neither chosen nor maintained. It is simply there, stable and unremarkable. The surface beneath the body is no longer perceived as support, because support is no longer something that needs to be registered. Breathing continues in a way that feels indistinguishable from the stillness around it, quiet and automatic, without depth or rhythm calling attention to itself. The nervous system is fully committed to this level of disengagement, and nothing pulls it back. The mind is no longer functioning as a point of reference. There is no inner voice commenting on experience, no awareness tracking what is happening, no recognition of thought appearing or disappearing. If any mental impressions arise, they do not form patterns and do not linger long enough to matter. They dissolve immediately into the same neutral background from which they emerged. There is no sense of losing thought, because thought is no longer something being held. Time does not return in any recognizable form. There is no internal sense of duration, no feeling of minutes passing, no awareness of sequence. The night does not feel long or short. It does not feel like it is moving forward. It simply exists as a steady condition, unmeasured and unmarked. Proverbs speak often of patience, but here patience is fully transformed into timelessness, into a state where waiting has no object and no direction. Sound remains present only as uniform presence. Words no longer arrive as meaning or instruction. They blend seamlessly into silence, forming a continuous tonal field that does not rise, fall, or shift. There is no beginning or ending to what is heard. There's no distinction between listening and not listening. Everything merges into the same unbroken layer of experience, reinforcing stability rather than attention. The sense of self has dissolved almost entirely into this background. There is no awareness of position, identity, or separation. The experience no longer centers around an observer resting. There is simply rest itself, steady and impersonal. The Proverbs do not address the self at this level. They do not reinforce identity or awareness. They remain neutral, allowing rest to deepen without interference. There is no internal checking for safety, because safety is no longer a concept being evaluated. The body does not scan. The mind does not monitor. Nothing prepares for interruption. The night holds everything in a way that does not require defense. The Proverbs align perfectly with this holding by remaining unchanged, predictable, and non-reactive. At T's depth, even the idea of depth itself becomes unnecessary. There is no comparison to shallower states, no awareness of having gone further. The experience does not need context. It does not need explanation. It simply continues, stable and uninterrupted, allowing the deepest layers of sleep to sustain themselves naturally. Awareness may flicker briefly, but it does not organize itself into wakefulness. It dissolves again immediately, without resistance or consequence. Nothing resets, nothing restarts. The body does not adjust. The mind does not re-engage. The night absorbs these flickers without change, maintaining the same steady field of rest. The Proverbs remain exactly as they are, unaffected by awareness or its absence, not needing to be heard, remembered, or followed, existing only as quiet continuity beneath experience. They do not conclude. They do not signal transition. They remain present while rest continues on its own. This state does not move toward an ending. It does not prepare for anything else. It simply remains stable, neutral, and undisturbed, holding the body and mind in a condition where nothing needs to happen and nothing needs to return. Block 10. When Proverbs remain as quiet, order and rest continues, without end. At this final depth of the night, there is no longer any sense of arriving or departing, because arrival and departure both belong to effort, and effort has completely dissolved. The Proverbs are no longer perceived as content, guidance, or even presence in the usual sense. They exist now as quiet order beneath everything. The same way balance exists without being noticed and gravity works without instruction. The night is stabilized into a condition that does not progress and does not resolve. And within that condition, rest continues on its own, unmonitored and uninterrupted. The body remains fully disengaged from intention. There is no muscular adjustment, no internal signal calling for movement, no subtle readiness waiting for instruction. The posture the body occupies has lost all relevance, because posture implies awareness, and awareness is no longer organizing experience. The surface beneath the body is not registered as support, and the body is not registered as something being supported. Sensation has evened out into a neutral field where no single point asks for attention. Breathing continues quietly, automatic and sufficient, neither deep nor shallow in a way that matters, blending so completely with the stillness that it no longer feels separate from it. The nervous system has fully committed to this state, and nothing within it suggests the need to shift. The mind has stepped entirely out of its former role. There is no inner narration, no monitoring, no evaluation of depth or quality. Thought, if it appears at all, has no continuity, no gravity, no persistence. It dissolves before it can be recognized as thought. There is no awareness of losing thinking, because thinking is no longer something being held. The Proverbs do not interact with the mind here. They exist beneath it, unchanged and unaffected, providing continuity without engagement and stability without response. Time has lost every remaining trace of structure. There is no sense of duration passing, no awareness of sequence, no orientation toward past or future. The night is not experienced as long or short. It is not experienced as moving forward. It is simply present as an unmeasured condition. Proverbs speak often of patience and waiting, but here waiting has completely transformed into timelessness, into a state where nothing is anticipated and nothing is postponed. The experience has no direction, and because of that, it has no tension. Sound remains only as uniform presence. Words no longer arrive as language, meaning, or instruction. They blend seamlessly into silence, forming a continuous tonal field that does not rise, fall, or vary. There is no distinction between listening and not listening, because attention is no longer being applied. Everything merges into the same steady layer of experience, reinforcing sameness and stability. This sameness is not dull or empty. It is soothing, predictable, and deeply supportive of uninterrupted rest. The sense of self has softened beyond relevance. There is no awareness of identity resting, no sense of position, no feeling of separation between inner and outer. The experience no longer centers around someone sleeping. There is simply sleep itself, steady and impersonal. The Proverbs do not address the self here. They allow it to fade completely, knowing that the deepest rest occurs when self-reference disappears. There is no vigilance anywhere in the system. No part of the body is scanning for safety. No part of the mind is monitoring continuity. Nothing is prepared for interruption, because interruption is no longer a reference point. The night holds everything without effort, and the Proverbs align perfectly with this holding by remaining unchanged, predictable, and neutral. Nothing new is introduced. Nothing is emphasized. Nothing calls attention to itself. At this depth, even the idea of depth no longer applies. There is no comparison to earlier stages, no sense of having gone further. The experience does not need context, explanation, or reinforcement. It simply remains exactly as it is, stable and unmarked, allowing the deepest layers of sleep to sustain themselves naturally and continuously. Awareness may surface briefly, but it does not assemble into wakefulness. It dissolves again without friction or consequence. Nothing resets. The body does not reorient. The mind does not re-engage. The night absorbs these brief flickers without change, maintaining the same steady field of rest without disturbance. The Proverbs remain exactly as they are, unaffected by awareness or its absence, not needing to be heard, remembered, or followed. They do not conclude. They do not signal completion. They remain as quiet continuity beneath experience, supporting rest in the most complete and undemanding way possible, staying present long after attention has faded and long after sleep has fully taken over. The night continues in this way, stable and uninterrupted, without edge or boundary, without beginning or end, holding everything in place while rest sustains itself, silently and completely.